The army laughed when Morwenna Vale was told her hands were no longer needed. They stood in the cloak hall of Fenhall beneath rows of hanging winter war cloaks, each one black, silver-edged, and heavy enough to bury a weaker man. Outside, snow beat against the high windows like thrown bone. By dawn, Alpha King Roric Fenhall would lead 10,000 wolf warriors north through the White Ravine, where ordinary cloth froze stiff in one breath and unprotected flesh split before the second. But the War Council had gathered not to honor the woman who had stitched their survival for half her life. They had gathered to replace her. Morwenna stood at the long seam table with a needle between her fingers and silver thread looped around her wrist. She was 36, unmarried, childless, and old enough that the younger seam women whispered spinster, as if the word itself were a verdict. Her dark hair had begun to silver at the temples. Her hands were narrow, scarred, and steady. Every scar had a season. Every bent knuckle had a battle. War Seam-Matron Elska Dorne held up the seam ledger before the council. Morwenna Vale's service has been useful, Elska said. Useful, not sacred, not necessary, not named. Yet the winter campaign requires fresh speed, Elska continued, her voice smooth as oiled shears. The old method is too slow, too sentimental, too dependent on one woman's private habits. A few commanders chuckled. Morwenna did not lower her eyes. That seemed to offend them more than tears would have. A young captain near the front muttered, "No sons to send, no husband to mourn. What does she know of war?" The words reached farther than he intended. Morwenna's needle stopped, not because he had wounded her, because the cloak beneath her hand did. The black wool twitched once against the table as if something sleeping inside the fabric had heard insult and almost risen. Elska saw it. Her smile thinned. At the far end of the hall, Alpha King Roric Fenhall stood with his war mantle unfastened at his shoulders. He was taller than every commander around him, broad and dark-haired, with a face carved by winter campaigns and pale grey eyes that never appeared fully human. His wolf was close to the surface tonight. Every man in the hall felt it and chose his words more carefully near him, except when speaking of Morwenna. That had always been allowed. Roric looked from the twitching cloak to Morwenna's hand. For one breath, she thought he had seen it. Then Elska stepped forward and closed the ledger with a snap. "The council agrees," she said. "Morwenna Vale is relieved from final thread duty. Her final thread knot will be cut before the cloaks are issued." The silver thread tightened around Morwenna's wrist, so sharply she almost bled. She glanced down. The thread should have lain soft and loose. Instead, it had coiled once around her pulse, bright as moonlit wire. The unfinished cloak beneath her fingers turned cold at the hem, not with winter but with refusal. Roric's gaze sharpened again. "Final thread duty?" he asked. Elska inclined her head. "A ceremonial habit, my king. Old seam women like to believe the last stitch matters more than the 100 before it." Several councilmen smiled. Morwenna looked at the cloaks hanging in their long rows. She knew everyone. She knew where the shoulder seams had been reinforced for men who favored the left side in battle. She knew which commanders had lost brothers in the ravine and which soldiers prayed silently before putting on wool. She had stitched winter oaths into those cloaks while the men slept, while widows waited, while kings took credit for armies returning alive. The final thread was not ceremony. It was the promise that the cloak would remember the body inside it. Roric turned to Morwenna. "Is that true?" The hall stilled. Elska's fingers tightened around the ledger. Morwenna felt every eye on her age. Her empty ring finger, her plain grey dress, the soft pouch of thread at her belt instead of a warrior's blade. She had spent years being treated as a woman who had missed the only duties that mattered. No husband's name, no child's cradle, no place in songs, only needlework, only warmth. But warmth had kept more men alive than songs ever had. "No, my king," she said. Elska's mouth hardened. Roric did not look away. "Then speak." Morwenna set the needle down. It sounded impossibly small on the table. "If my name is removed, do not issue those cloaks." A cold laugh moved through the council. Elska turned, seizing the moment. "You hear her. Threats now. Possession. As I warned, she has mistaken royal property for personal work." Morwenna looked at her. I mistook nothing. Then prove obedience. Elska opened the seam coffer and drew out a silver knot no larger than a wolf's tooth. Morwenna's breath stopped. It was not decoration. It was the first final thread knot she had tied for Fenhall, the hidden anchor from which every winter war cloak had learned to remember a living body. Roric's voice cut across the table. No blade touches her work until I know what it holds. Elska bowed without lowering the knife. Of course, my king. I am not cutting her work. Her smile thinned. I am cutting her claim to it. Morwenna felt the silver thread tighten again around her wrist. This time a bead of blood rose. The unfinished cloak drank the drop before it touched the table. Every hanging war cloak in the hall shuddered. No one laughed now. Elska's eyes flashed with fear, quick and hidden. Then the knife came down. The blade cut through the silver final thread knot. At once, the first cloak froze. It happened at the shoulders of a soldier standing near the issue rack. The black wool hardened with a crack like lake ice. The soldier gasped, reaching for the clasp at his throat, but the cloak locked around him, pinning his arms to his sides. Then another cloak froze. Then another. Across the cloak hall, wolf warriors staggered. As their own mantles stiffened around them, silver seams blazing white. Men shouted. Boots slipped. A commander fell to one knee, trapped inside his glowing war cloak, as frost climbed over his armor. Outside, horns sounded across the army yard. One by one, the winter war cloaks of Fenhall refused to move. Roric seized Elska's wrist before she could hide the severed knot. His voice dropped into a growl that shook snow from the rafters. What did you cut? Morwenna pulled the silver thread from her bleeding wrist and let it fall across the frozen seam table. The only stitch your army ever came home wearing, she said. Then every frozen cloak turned its collar toward her. The army yard erupted before anyone in the cloak hall understood the scale of the ruin. Horns screamed through the snow. Men shouted from the outer racks. Wolves howled in panic, not battle rage, but fear, the raw sound of warriors trapped inside the very cloaks meant to carry them through winter. Beyond the open archways, soldiers staggered beneath black mantles gone rigid as coffins, their arms pinned their shoulders, locked silver seams blazing white across their backs. The White Ravine campaign had failed before the first march drum sounded. Morwenna stood at the seam table with blood drying around her wrist. The severed final thread knot lay in Elska Dorne's hand. No larger than a wolf's tooth. No heavier than a secret. And yet 10,000 war cloaks had frozen when it was cut. Elska recovered faster than the council. She always had. Her fear vanished behind a look of wounded authority sharp enough to make weaker women apologize for breathing. She cursed them, Elska said. The nearest commanders turned at once. Elska lifted the broken knot. You all saw it. The moment her private claim was cut, the cloaks turned against Fenhall's army. This is not oathcraft. It is possession. Morwenna looked at the frozen soldiers outside. One had fallen near the threshold, his breath smoking hard as two men tried and failed to pry open his cloak clasp. The black wool held him like iron. But it had not crushed him. Not yet. That mattered. The cloaks were not killing the men. They were refusing to march. Roric Fenhall stepped between Morwenna and the council. No one touches Morwenna Vale. The command hit the hall like a wolf's jaws closing. A commander who had started toward her stopped with one boot half raised. Elska's mouth tightened. My king, she has bound your army. Roric did not look away from Morwenna, or someone unbound what kept it alive. The words struck quieter than a roar. Morwenna felt them anyway. She did not thank him. She would not warm herself on one decent sentence after years of silence. Roric had stood in war halls wearing cloaks. Her hands had finished, and let men call that labor women's habit. He did not get absolution because winter had finally made her visible. You want proof? Morwenna asked. Elska's eyes narrowed. Proof of what? That you cut more than thread. Morwenna turned toward the outer racks. Bring me a cloak from a soldier who survived White Ravine. No one moved. Then Roric did. Not to fetch it himself, but to command. Captain Odrin, your cloak. A scarred man near the doorway stiffened. Frost had locked his mantle at the shoulders, but he was not fully trapped. 2 guards helped him forward. He was older than most of the captains, with a white scar crossing his jaw and a limp the army pretended not to notice because he had earned it in the ravine. His cloak was laid across the seam table. It landed stiff and cold. Morwenna placed her scarred fingers on the shoulder seam. The cloth should have felt dead. Instead, beneath the ice, she felt a pulse like a memory trying to wake. "This man took an arrow under the left rib 8 winters ago," she said. Odrin's face changed. Morwenna traced a silver seam near the lining. He could not lift his right arm after the 3rd day's march. He favored his left side so the cloak learned to pull warmth across the rib and leave his sword shoulder free. The hole quieted. Odrin swallowed. No healer knew that. "I am not a healer." Morwenna lifted the lining. Inside the black wool hidden beneath the official Fenhall stitchwork ran a faint red-silver pattern. Not decorative, not symmetrical. It curved like breath around the places a body broke and survived. Body memory stitches, Morwenna said. Heartbeat, old wounds, weight of the arm, heat of the lungs. The oath to come home still living. That is what the final thread binds. Elska laughed too quickly. Poetry. Morwenna pressed her bleeding wrist to the seam. The cloak drank 1 red bead. At once the frozen wool loosened around Captain Odrin's shoulders. The silver seams dimmed from white to soft grey. He inhaled sharply as warmth ran through the cloth and into his chest. Then he sank to one knee. Not to Roric, to Morwenna. "My lady," he said, voice rough. "I came home from White Ravine because of this." Morwenna's throat tightened. She hated that he sounded grateful. She hated more that no one had asked sooner. "No," she said. "You came home because you fought. The cloak only remembered how to help you live." Roric looked at the hidden stitches as if he was seeing the army's true armor for the first time. Elska saw the same danger. If the council understood that Morwenna's work held body memory, then fast war seaming was not innovation. It was fraud. Weak cloth sold as protection. Profit dressed as reform. Elska's hand slipped toward the seam coffer. Morwenna saw it. So did Roric. He caught Elska's wrist against the table. "Open your hand." Elska smiled through her teeth. "You mistake suspicion for justice. I mistake nothing tonight." Slowly her fingers opened. Inside her palm lay 3 more silver knots. Not Fenhall knots. Rival colors were twisted through them, red for Thornmere, blue, black for Carag, pale iron for Vosk. The council stared. Roric's voice dropped. "You sold our cloak oaths." Elska's face hardened. "I sold efficiency to men willing to pay for war that moves faster than old women's superstition." Morwenna reached for the knots, but before she touched them, a deep sound rolled from the far end of the hall. Cloth moving without hands. Roric's own war mantle slid from its iron stand. It did not freeze. It crossed the black floor, heavy and silent silver seams glowing low. Every soldier turned as the Alpha King's mantle stopped before Morwenna Vale. Then it folded at the collar and sank to the ground. Like a wolf lowering its head, Morwenna stared at it, breath caught. Roric went utterly still. The mantle's inner seam opened, revealing 1 old final thread darker than all the rest. Morwenna knew it. She had stitched it 16 winters ago after Roric's first battle, when he was not yet king and had bled through a cloak no one else knew how to save. Elska whispered impossible. Roric looked from the kneeling mantle to Morwenna, and for the first time the Alpha King understood that his own war cloak had remembered her before he did. The march drums stopped outside. One by one their thunder died until only the snow remained hissing against the high windows of the cloak hall. 10,000 soldiers waited in frozen war cloaks. A winter campaign stood ruined before it began. And at the center of the hall, Alpha King Roric Fenhall's own mantle lay folded before Morwenna Vale, like a wolf offering its throat. No one laughed now. Morwenna looked at the old final thread inside the mantle's lining and felt 16 winters close around her fingers. She remembered the boy Roric had been after his first battle, too proud to groan, while blood soaked through his cloak, too young to understand that a wound could enter deeper than flesh. He had been heir then, not king. She had been a seamstress, no council bothered to name. She had stitched through the night so his cloak would remember how to hold warmth over the place his wolf had nearly frozen. Roric stared at the mantle. "You made this for me," he said. "No," Morwenna answered. "I repaired what war had already taken from you." Elska's voice cut through the moment. "Do you hear her?" She admits it. She placed private stitches in the king's mantle without royal witness. Several commanders shifted. Elska turned on them with the precision of a woman who knew fear could be sewn into any room. If her thread can make a cloak kneel, what else can it make? Obey your shoulders, your hands, your wolves. A ripple of unease moved through the hall. Morwenna felt it touch every frozen cloak. The mantles tightened. Men outside cried out. Roric's head snapped toward the doors. "Stop speaking." Elska bowed, but not in submission. "My king, the army is bound in cloth that answers her before it answers Fenhall." Roric stepped between her and Morwenna again. "No one accuses her of treason while wearing protection her hands made." Elska smiled. "Then remove it." Silence struck the hall. A simple challenge. A cruel one. If the commanders removed their cloaks, they would freeze before crossing the yard. If they kept wearing them, they would have to admit Morwenna's work had guarded their bodies more faithfully than their own counsel. Morwenna set one hand on Roric's mantle. It shivered beneath her palm. "Bring the seam lamp," she said. Elska's eyes narrowed. "You give orders now." Morwenna looked at the frozen soldiers outside. "No, I save men. There is a difference." Roric did not smile, but something in his face changed. "Bring it." A young seam woman hurried forward with the blue glass lamp used to inspect hidden threadwork. Elska tried to take it from her, but Roric's growl stopped her hand in the air. The lamp was set on the table. Morwenna lifted Roric's mantle and laid it open beneath the blue flame. At first, only black wool showed. Then the hidden stitches woke. Lines of red-silver thread moved under the lining like veins under skin. They circled an old tear near the left shoulder, crossed the spine, then curved down toward the heart. The pattern was not decorative. It was a map of a body that had survived only because cloth had learned where pain lived. Captain Odrin whispered. "All our cloaks have that no Morwenna said. Every cloak has its own." The hall went still. "Your cloak knows your arrow wound. His knows the shoulder he dislocated in the Eastern Siege. Another knows the lung that never healed after frost fever. A war cloak does not protect an army by being strong." She touched the final thread inside Roric's mantle. "It protects one living body by remembering how that body breaks." Roric's face had gone pale, not with fear of her, with recognition. Morwenna looked up. "Your mantle never froze because this thread is older than Elska's cut. It was the first knot. The anchor." Elska's voice sharpened. "Then cut it." Roric turned on her. She lifted both hands, pretending reason. "If her claim is harmless, sever the king's private stitch. Let the mantle prove it serves Fenhall, not Morwenna Vale." The commanders looked at Roric. Morwenna felt the trap. If he refused, Elska would claim the king himself was bound by her. If he agreed, the oldest body memory thread in Fenhall's cloaks would be destroyed. Roric reached for the mantle. Morwenna caught his wrist. Gasps moved through the room. No one touched the Alpha King without permission. She did not let go. "You do not cut a living stitch to satisfy a dead argument," she said. His pale gray eyes dropped to her hand on his wrist. For a heartbeat, the hole narrowed to the warmth of his skin beneath her scarred fingers and the dangerous stillness of the wolf inside him. Then Roric turned his wrist not to break free, but to place his hand beneath hers. "Then tell me what it costs to prove the truth." Morwenna hated the softness that almost entered her. She crushed it. "It costs pain." "I have paid that before." "No." She looked at the old thread. "This time you will feel what the cloak has carried for you." Before Elska could object, Morwenna pulled the final thread through the blue lamplight. The mantle opened its memory. Roric staggered. Not far. One step. But every wolf in the hall felt it. A blast of old winter burst from the cloak, the air filled with the scent of blood-ravine snow and young wolf fear. The hidden stitch showed what it had held for 16 years, Roric on his knees after his first battle, one hand pressed to his side, his wolf shadow half outside his body and rimed with white frost. Morwenna saw the truth she had never been told. She had not merely repaired a cloak. She had stitched warmth around a dying royal wolf. Roric's breath turned silver. Elska whispered, almost pleased, "There. The king is not protected by her thread. He is dependent on it." The old final thread tightened around Morwenna's bleeding wrist. Then Roric's mantle lifted its empty collar toward her and opened the inner seam. Inside, hidden under 16 winters of black wool, a frost-white mark began to glow. Morwenna read the shape with a seamstress's eye and went cold. "It was not war frost," she said. Roric looked at her. Morwenna's voice dropped. "Someone cut your wolf before I ever touched your cloak." The blue seam lamp began to gutter. Its flame bent toward Roric's mantle, thin and frightened, as if the frost-white mark hidden under the black wool had drawn breath from the room. The soldiers outside still struggled in frozen cloaks. The campaign horns had fallen silent. No commander dared shout while the Alpha King stood with his own wound exposed in cloth. Morwenna kept one hand on the old final thread. It trembled against her skin. Roric's face had turned hard, but not with anger. He was forcing pain behind the mask of a king, the same way wounded men held blood inside their mouths so their captains would not see them weaken. Elska stepped forward at once. "There is your proof," she said. "Private stitchwork around the king's wolf, hidden for 16 winters." She admits she touched it before any council witnessed her hand. Morwenna did not look at her. "I did not cut him. Can you prove that?" "Yes." The answer came so quickly that Elska's mouth closed. Morwenna lifted the mantle higher under the blue light. A living stitch bends toward warmth. A body memory stitch follows pulse scar breath pain. This mark does none of those. Roric's eyes narrowed. "Then what does it follow, Morwenna?" Touched the frost-white line with the blunt side of her needle. The mark recoiled. Men cursed under their breath. "Fear," she said. "It follows fear." Elska laughed too loudly. "Cloth cannot fear," no, Morwenna said, "but a wolf can." The mantle convulsed on the table. Beneath the lining, the old hidden stitches flared red-silver around Roric's first wound. The frost-white mark did not flare. It opened like a mouth. A sound came from it, not a howl, a command. "Kneel." Every frozen cloak in the yard tightened. Warriors cried out as black wool locked harder around their throats and shoulders. Captain Odrin slammed a fist into the table, face gray with pain. "Make it stop." Elska turned instantly. "She is making it speak." Roric moved before the accusation could grow teeth. He seized the edge of his mantle and pulled it toward himself, letting the frost-white mark crawl over his bare hand. Ice bit across his knuckles. "If it speaks through my wound," he said, voice rough, "then it speaks through me first." The mark burned white. Roric's breath broke, but he did not release it. Morwenna felt something sharp twist in her chest. Foolish man, brave man, still not forgiven. She stepped closer and drove her needle through the edge of the frost mark. The dead seam screamed. The sound tore through the cloak hall high and thin, making wolves bare their teeth and seam women clutch their ears. The blue lamp shattered. Darkness rushed in, broken only by the red-silver glow of Morwenna's old stitches. Inside that glow, the mark revealed its pattern. Not Fenhall, not Morwenna's. A rival cut made with winter iron thread and sealed under the skin of Roric's wolf before the cloak ever reached her table. Someone had wounded the young prince's beast in battle, then hidden the command beneath frost so it would wake only when Fenhall marched through deep winter. Morwenna's final thread had not bound Roric. It had kept the command asleep. Roric looked at the mark with cold understanding. "Who had access to my cloak after White Ravine?" No one answered. Elska's face had gone too still. Morwenna saw it. So did Roric. The Alpha King turned toward her. "Elska." She lifted her chin. "I was not Seam-Matron then," no, Morwenna said softly. "But your mother was." The hall shifted. Elska's eyes flashed. "There." a pulled thread. Morwenna reached for the seam coffer before Elska could stop her. Inside lay the 3 rival-colored knots they had found in her palm: Thornmere red Carrag, blue-black Vosk pale iron. Morwenna held them beneath the broken lamp's dying glow. The same frost-white pattern shone inside each knot. Captain Odrin whispered. "Those are not cloak oaths," No, Morwenna said. "They are command seams." Roric's voice became dangerously quiet. "Explain." Elska stepped back, but the frozen cloaks outside blocked the doors. Her own work had made the hall a cage. Morwenna turned one rival knot between her fingers. Fast war seaming does not teach a cloak to remember a body. It teaches it to obey the first command sewn into it. Whoever holds the command seam can lock the cloak, steer the wearer, or stop the wolf beneath it. The commanders stared at the frozen army yard, at 10,000 trapped soldiers, at the campaign that would have marched into White Ravine wearing obedience disguised as protection. Roric released his mantle and faced Elska fully. "You sold my army's throats." Elska's mask broke. "Only for a breath." Then she smiled. "You still need me," she said, "because your seamstress can expose a dead seam, but she cannot cut 10,000 before dawn." Morwenna looked past her to the yard where frozen cloaks glowed white in the snow. Then the newest war cloaks began turning their collars north, not toward Morwenna, not toward Roric, toward the White Ravine where rival horns started answering through the storm. The first soldier moved without choosing to. His frozen cloak dragged one boot forward across the army yard. He cursed fighting it, but the black wool held his shoulders and pulled again. Around him, dozens of newer war cloaks began to turn the bodies inside them slow and terrible toward the northern gate. Not soldiers marching. Cloth marching with soldiers trapped inside. Panic broke through the yard. "Cut them off," a commander shouted. A guard swung his axe at the nearest cloak clasp. The blade struck silver seam and bounced back hard enough to split his palm. The frozen soldier inside cried out as if the cut had landed on his own ribs. Morwenna shoved past 2 councilmen and reached the archway. "Stop cutting the cloth!" The guard froze. Elska laughed behind her. "Listen to her. She protects the cloaks before the men." Morwenna turned sharply. "The command seam has tied cloth sense to body sense. Cut blindly, and you cut the man inside." The commander went pale. Outside, rival horns sounded again through the storm. The newest cloaks answered. One row of soldiers lurched forward. Roric moved faster than the council could think. He strode into the yard, seized the first frozen warrior by both shoulders, and planted his boots against the pull. His alpha command rolled over the stones. "Hold." The soldiers stopped. So did the row behind him, for one breath. Then the command seams flared white. Roric's jaw locked. The force of the rival stitch struck him through every cloak he had commanded to halt. Frost raced over his gauntlets. His own mantle snapped open behind him like a wounded wing, old red-silver thread straining against the dead seam hidden in his wolf. Morwenna saw his pain before anyone else did. He was holding the army still by taking the command into himself. Fool, king, both. Elska saw it too, and satisfaction warmed her face. "Careful, my king. A body can only hold so many disobedient threads before it tears." Morwenna turned to the seam women huddled near the racks. "Bring me the oldest cloaks. Not the new ones. The ones that survived 3 winters or more." They stared at her. Then one young woman moved, then another. Elska snapped. "Do not obey her." A seam woman with red-rimmed eyes looked at the yard at her brother trapped in a frozen cloak, then at Morwenna. "I am done obeying women who sell weak seams as safety." She ran. Within moments, old war cloaks were dragged to the stone threshold and laid across the floor. They were scarred, smoke-stained, patched at shoulders and hems. None were beautiful. All were alive with quiet memory. Morwenna knelt among them. Her fingers shook once, not from fear. From rage kept disciplined. "Body memory stitches cannot command an army," she said. "That is why Elska hated them. Each cloak answers one living body. One wound, one breath, one oath to return." Roric grunted in the yard as another wave of white seam light struck him. Morwenna did not look up. If she did, she might lose the thread of thought. She pulled Captain Odrin's old cloak closer and pressed her palm to its lining. "Odrin, speak your survival oath." The captain knelt still, half wrapped in his loosened cloak. "I return with my breath, my blood, and my wolf unbroken." The old cloak warmed. Red silver light ran through its stitches. Morwenna pulled another cloak toward her. "Name." The soldier answered from the doorway, voice shaking. "Harl then." "Survival oath." "I return with both hands if the moon allows." His old cloak warmed. One by one, names and oaths rose through the snow-dark hall. Not noble lineage, not ranks, living bodies, broken bones. Promises whispered before campaigns by men who thought no one but cloth had heard them. The old cloaks began to glow. Elska stepped back. Morwenna saw why. The red-silver threads were not spreading from her alone. They were answering through every veteran cloak she had ever finished. A web of body memory formed across the threshold, old protection waking against new obedience. Roric's voice broke through the yard. "Morwenna." She looked up. He was on one knee now, still holding the frozen row from marching. Frost had climbed to his throat. His eyes remained clear, but the wolf behind them was close to breaking. "Whatever you mean to do," he said, "do it now. No command, no demand. Only trust offered too late and still offered fully." Morwenna drew her needle from her sleeve. Elska's eyes widened. "You cannot override command seams without the master knot." Morwenna looked at the severed silver final thread knot on the seam table. "No," she said, "I cannot." Then she wrapped the loose silver thread around her own bleeding wrist. "But I can teach the cloaks to remember who they were before you sold them." She drove the needle through her palm. The old cloaks flared red. Every soldier in the yard screamed at once as the body memory web struck the frozen command seams, not breaking them, waking them. For one terrible breath, Morwenna felt 10,000 bodies through her hand, old wounds, racing hearts, frost-bitten lungs, fear, rage, breath, blood wolves trapped under cloth. She nearly collapsed. Roric rose, tearing frost from his own arm by force, and caught her before she struck the stones. Elska whispered, "If she carries all of them, it will kill her." Morwenna's blood ran down the silver thread. Across the yard, the newest cloaks stopped marching north. Then every collar turned back toward the cloak hall, toward Morwenna. And beneath all 10,000 seams, one hidden master knot began to glow inside Elska Dorne's own sleeve. Elska felt the hidden thread burn before anyone else saw it. Her hand flew to her sleeve. Too late. Red silver light shone through the dark fabric at her wrist, pulsing in answer to Morwenna's blood across the threshold. The soldiers in the yard stopped screaming one by one. Their cloaks still held them rigid, but the white command seams no longer dragged them north. They waited. So did the hall. Morwenna tried to stand and nearly fell. Roric caught her with one arm around her waist. The strength in him was brutal and careful at once. Frost still crawled over his throat from holding the army's pain, yet his grip did not shake. "Do not spend another breath for men who mocked you," he said low enough that only she heard. Morwenna looked at the trapped soldiers beyond him. "They mocked me. Their cloaks did not." Something moved across his face. Pain, respect, something more dangerous still unnamed. Elska backed toward the seam coffer. Roric's head lifted. "Show your wrist." She smiled. "You command armies, my king, not seam-matrons." "No," Morwenna said, pulling free of Roric's arm. "He commands armies. You command cloth that was never yours." The insult struck deeper than a blade. Elska tore her sleeve open. A knot lay bound against her wrist, not silver alone, but twisted with black winter iron, and threads dyed in rival colors. Thornmere red, Carag blue-black, Vosk pale iron. At its center beat a dark stitch like a small second heart. The commanders stared. Captain Odrin whispered, "That was pulling us." Elska lifted her chin. "That was saving Fenhall from an aging seamstress who made herself necessary." Morwenna laughed once. "It was not soft. I made survival necessary. Elska's eyes flashed. She hooked one finger through the master knot and pulled. The yard convulsed. Every frozen cloak tightened at once. Soldiers choked as collars rose against their throats. The newer cloaks began to kneel, not in respect but in forced submission. The white command seams blazed so bright the snow around them turned blue. Roric roared. His alpha command struck the yard. Hold! The soldiers stopped dying, but the cost hit him. He dropped to one knee as frost split across his jaw and down his chest. His old mantle flared behind him, the first thread inside it burning red as it fought the dead seam in his wolf. Morwenna saw what he was doing. He was standing between her body memory web and Elska's command, taking the strain that should have torn through Morwenna's palm. "You fool," she hissed. Roric's mouth curved without warmth. "You keep saying that like I have learned better." Then blood slid from his nose. Morwenna turned on Elska. "Release the knot." Elska tightened her fist. "No. Kneel to me as War Seam-Matron, restore my authority before the council, and I will loosen them. You would bargain with men's throats, I learned from kings." The line landed. Roric did not deny it. Morwenna stepped toward Elska, silver thread dragging from her bleeding hand. "You wanted fast war seaming, because body memory cannot be stolen in bulk. It must be earned cloak by cloak, scar by scar. That was too slow for profit." Elska's face hardened. "You sold weak cloak oaths to rivals," Morwenna continued, "then sewed command seams into Fenhall's newest cloaks so the army would march into White Ravine and fail when your buyers called." A mourn-like hush fell over the council, not the same house, not the same crime, but the same old fear of truth becoming public. Elska smiled with her teeth. "You are missing the cruelest part." She raised her wrist. The master knot pulsed again. The rival packs did not buy failure. They bought obedience. Fenhall soldiers would cross the ravine alive, reach the north ridge, and turn their blades when the command sounded. The soldiers in the yard understood before the council did. Horror moved through them like wind through grass. Roric lifted his head, eyes gone, almost wolf-white. "You sold my army as a weapon against itself." "I sold a future," Elska snapped. "One not ruled by slow stitches, old women and kings who cannot tell labor from loyalty." Morwenna's wounded hand closed around the loose silver thread. "No," she said. "You sold men who trusted cloth to remember them." She flung the thread toward Elska's wrist. The silver line struck the master knot and wrapped around it. Elska screamed. Not from pain, from contact. The master knot opened its memory. For one sharp instant the hall saw what lived inside it. Not one thread, but hundreds of cut, final thread ends stolen from discarded cloaks, burial cloaks, failed campaign repairs, and seam baskets where no one thought to count old. Women's work. Elska had built her command from severed oaths. Morwenna staggered. Roric caught the thread with his bleeding hand before it could tear through her palm. "Use me." She stared at him. "No. Yes. It will hurt. It already does." His hand closed over the thread. Together, King's blood and seamstress's blood pulled. The master knot tore free from Elska's wrist and flew across the hall, slamming onto the seam table. White command light burst from it, then shot outward through the army yard toward the northern gate. Not to the soldiers, to the Fenhall war standard standing in the storm. The black wolf banner began to glow with the same frost-white mark hidden in Roric's mantle. Morwenna went cold. Elska, trembling and pale, started to smile. "You found the knot," she whispered, "but not the root." Outside, the war standard turned toward White Ravine by itself. The northern gate began to open without hands. Iron teeth groaned up through packed snow while the Fenhall war standard leaned into the storm, its black wolf banner glowing with frost-white veins. Soldiers trapped inside their cloaks turned toward it in jerking lines, not walking yet but waiting for the next pull. Beyond the gate, White Ravine answered with horns. Enemy horns. Roric pushed himself upright, blood still dark on his palm where he had gripped Morwenna's silver thread. Frost cracked along his jaw. His eyes had gone wolf-bright, but the beast behind them looked wounded, forced to stand on broken legs. "Close the gate," he ordered. 3 guards ran to the wheel. The war standard snapped once in the wind. All 3 men froze mid-step, cloaks locking around their bodies. One fell sideways into the snow, unable to lift his arms. Elska laughed softly from the seam table. "You cannot close what your own banner has opened." Morwenna turned toward her. "What did you stitch into it?" Elska's smile was thin and bloodless. "Not I. A seam older than my authority, older than yours. My mother only preserved what Fenhall should have used years ago." Roric's voice became lethal. "Used for what? To make armies obey when courage fails." The words moved through the yard like sickness. Morwenna walked past Roric before he could stop her. "Morwenna." She did not turn. "If you command me now, I will ignore you." A silence fell behind her. Then Roric said, "I was going to say the snow is deeper near the standard." That almost hurt worse. Because it was not a command. It was care learning to hold its tongue. Morwenna stepped into the yard. The cold struck her lungs, but the old cloaks laid across the threshold glowed behind her, their body memory stitches still awake. They warmed the path just enough for her to reach the war standard without falling. The banner towered above her, black wolf cloth snapping against the pole. It had led Fenhall through 4 reigns, 3 northern wars, and more graves than any song admitted. Morwenna had patched its edge twice, never allowed near the central seam. That work belonged to War Seam-Matrons. Now she knew why. She pressed her bleeding palm against the pole. The frost-white mark opened. A command slammed into her skull. "March. Kneel. Turn. Kill." Morwenna staggered but did not fall. Her needle hand clenched around the silver thread at her wrist. Beneath the command, she felt something buried deeper, not cloth memory, not body memory, but pack memory. Hundreds of oaths tied to the banner each soldier taught since boyhood, that the war standard meant home, king, and return. Elska's mother had not created loyalty. She had hooked a command seam through it. "You used their oath to Fenhall as a leash," Morwenna said. Elska's face hardened. A banner is meant to lead. A banner should be followed. Morwenna turned back toward the yard, not worn around the throat. The soldiers heard her. So did their cloaks. Silver seams flickered red under the ice. Elska saw it and struck the master knot with her fist. The war standard flared white. Every frozen cloak in the yard forced its wearer 1 step toward the gate. Roric moved. He slammed his bleeding hand around the banner pole above Morwenna's, taking the next command through his own body. The pull hit him hard enough to drive 1 knee into the snow. His old mantle whipped around him, red-silver stitches fighting the frost mark in his wolf. "Read it," he said through his teeth. Morwenna stared at him. "It will tear through you." Then read quickly. She hated him for making sacrifice look like the only road left. She hated herself for trusting the road anyway. Morwenna closed both hands around the banner seam and pulled the memory open. The yard vanished. She saw Roric at 17 half dead after battle, his wolf cut by a frost-white command hidden under enemy steel. She saw the old War Seam-Matron Elska's mother standing beside the Fenhall banner with a needle of winter iron. She did not heal the wound. She tied it to the war standard, binding the prince's damaged wolf to Fenhall's battle oaths, so he could still lead men through winter. Then she stitched a second thread beneath it, a hidden route. If Fenhall ever refused Dorne command, the banner could turn the army toward whoever held the master knot. Morwenna broke from the vision with a gasp. Roric's blood ran down the pole. Elska stood very still. Morwenna understood then. Elska had not merely betrayed Roric. She had inherited a weapon made from his wound. "You knew," Morwenna said. Elska lifted her chin. "I knew Fenhall survived because my mother made his broken wolf useful." Roric's grip tightened on the pole. The banner cracked with frost. Morwenna stepped between them before he could spend his last strength on rage. "No," she said to Elska. "He survived because a cloak remembered where he was hurt." Elska's smile twisted. "Then prove your old stitches are stronger than a war banner." Morwenna looked at the army yard. 10,000 men, 10,000 cloaks, 1 banner root feeding on their oath. She could not cut it from outside. The banner had to reject the command from within. Morwenna lifted her bleeding hand and faced the trapped soldiers. Every man who wants his cloak to remember his body instead of obey that banner, she called, "Speak your survival oath now." For a moment only, Snow answered. Then Captain Odrin forced breath past his frozen collar. "I return with my breath, my blood, and my wolf unbroken." Another soldier shouted hoarsely, "I return with both hands." Another, "I return with my brother's name." Another, "I return alive." The yard filled with oaths. Old cloaks glowed red. New cloaks flickered uncertainly. The war standard shook white frost, cracking under the weight of living voices. Elska screamed, "Silence them," the banner answered her. A frost-white thread shot from the standard and wrapped around Roric's throat. His eyes went wide. Morwenna caught the thread with both bleeding hands. The command burned into her palms. The war standard demanded one final price. To free the army, the first wounded wolf bound to the banner had to be unstitched. Roric looked at her frost, tightening around his breath. Morwenna understood before he spoke. If she cut the root, she might free every cloak in Fenhall and kill the king's wolf. Snow hissed against Morwenna's bleeding palms. The frost-white thread from the war standard burned between her hands and Roric's throat, thin as hair, strong as a noose. Around them, 10,000 soldiers strained inside their frozen cloaks, voices still rising with survival oaths, each vow striking the banner like a hammer against ice. "I return alive. I return with my brother's name. I return with my wolf unbroken." The war standard shook harder. Elska stood near the seam table with the master knot clutched in one hand, her face bright with fear and triumph. "You cannot save both," she called through the storm. "That is the truth your precious body memory cannot soften. Cut the root free, the army lose the king's wolf. Spare him and Fenhall marches where I send it." Roric's knees sank deeper into the snow. The thread tightened at his throat. "Cut it," he rasped. Morwenna did not look at him. "Be quiet." A few soldiers stared. Even half-strangled Roric almost smiled. Morwenna leaned closer to the banner pole. The old command seam pulsed beneath her fingers, hungry and cold. It had been sewn through Roric's wounded wolf and into Fenhall's battle oaths. Cut through forcefully and it would tear out the damaged part of him it had fed on for 16 winters. But cloth had rules. So did wounds. A dead seam could command. A living stitch could remember. Morwenna closed her eyes and followed the thread inward. Beneath the white command, beneath Elska's mother's winter iron work, beneath the stolen obedience and old fear, she found the first thing the banner had ever held. Not victory, not conquest. A boy's oath. Roric at 17 bleeding in snow, one hand buried in his wolf's fur, whispering through cracked lips that he would bring the men behind him home. Not win, not rule. Bring them home. Morwenna opened her eyes. "There," she whispered. Elska's smile faltered. "What you did not build this root on his weakness," Morwenna said. "You built it over his vow." Roric's gaze lifted to her. Pain moved through his face, but behind it came recognition. "You remember?" she asked. His voice was raw. "I remember the ravine. I remember blood. I remember thinking the banners looked too far away. And what did you promise?" The war standard jerked as if trying to silence him. Roric's teeth bared. "I promised no Fenhall soldier would be left to freeze behind me." The yard answered. Not with cheers, with breath. The living bodies inside the cloaks heard the oath their king had forgotten how to speak aloud. Morwenna seized the silver thread at her wrist and drove her needle through the frost-white command seam, not cutting, not breaking, but turning it. A seamstress did not always sever a bad stitch. Sometimes she unmade its direction until it no longer held the shape it was given. Elska screamed, "Stop her!" She yanked the master knot. The banner flared white. Every new cloak in the yard snapped tight, dragging the soldiers one brutal step toward the open gate. Roric choked as the thread at his throat bit deeper. Morwenna pulled harder. Blood ran down her fingers and into the seam. "Speak it again," she ordered. Roric's eyes burned wolf-bright. "No Fenhall soldier is left behind." The old cloaks glowed red. Captain Odrin shouted the words after him. Then another captain. then a row of infantry. Then the whole frozen yard took up the oath until it was no longer Roric's alone. No Fenhall soldier is left behind. The war standard buckled. For the first time, the black wolf banner bent not toward White Ravine, but toward the men it had been trying to command. Elska staggered. The master knot in her hand began to unravel. "No," she hissed. "No, they are soldiers. Soldiers obey." Morwenna looked at her across the snow. Soldiers survive. That was the stitch you never learned. She twisted the needle. The frost-white root split open not from Roric's wolf, but from the false command wrapped around his vow. The thread around his throat snapped. Roric fell forward, catching himself with one hand in the snow. At once, the army yard erupted in cracking ice. One cloak loosened, then another. Frozen collars dropped from throats. Shoulders unlocked. Sleeves softened. Men collapsed to their knees, gasping alive, their cloaks steaming red-silver in the winter air. The war standard still shook, but now its cloth turned toward Morwenna. Elska looked from the freeing cloaks to the unraveling knot on her palm. Her authority was coming apart, thread by thread. So she did the only thing left. She drove the master knot into her own chest. The rival colors vanished beneath her skin. Roric pushed himself up with a growl. Elska. Her eyes turned frost-white. The war standard went rigid. Then every weakened command seemed still hidden in the newest cloaks, lit again, not to march north, but to pull inward toward Elska's body. Morwenna understood too late. Elska had made herself the new route. The War Seam-Matron smiled with blood on her teeth. "If I cannot command Fenhall's army," she whispered, "then I will wear it." The first cloak tore free from its soldier and flew to Elska. It ripped from the man's shoulders with a sound like skin parting from ice. He collapsed into the snow, gasping alive but shaking, while the black war cloak snapped through the air and wrapped itself around Elska Dorne's body. Another followed, then another. Cloaks from the newest ranks peeled away from men who had trusted them for warmth and rose like dark wings toward the War Seam-Matron. Morwenna ran to the fallen soldier and pressed her fingers to his throat. Alive, barely. The cloak had not taken his life, only his protection. Elska stood beneath the war standard as the stolen mantles layered over her shoulders, arms, back, and throat. White command seams burned through the black wool until she looked less like a woman than a walking winter banner. Her eyes shone frost-white. The master knot pulsed beneath her ribs. Roric moved in front of Morwenna. His old mantle flared red-silver behind him, weak but defiant. Elska smiled. Still hiding her behind a king, how tender. Morwenna stood before Roric could answer. "No, he is standing because I am about to work." Roric glanced at her. She did not soften the warning in her eyes. "Do not spend yourself unless I ask." A flicker of grim amusement crossed his face. "I am learning." Elska lifted one arm. Every stolen cloak layered over her body opened its collar like a mouth. From each collar came a soldier's breath, trapped and smoking, the body memory stripped from its owner and fed into her stolen command. Captain Odrin staggered to Morwenna's side. "What is she doing?" "Making herself the wearer," Morwenna said. Elska heard and laughed. At last the old seamstress understands. A cloak remembers a body. So I will become the body they remember. She swept her hand toward the army yard. The newest soldiers began to fall one by one as their cloaks abandoned them. Frost hit unprotected skin. Men curled around themselves in the snow. Older cloaks tried to crawl toward them, red-silver stitches glowing, but the command from Elska's chest dragged them back. Morwenna's hands shook. This was not fear now. This was fury. Elska had not only stolen oaths, she had inverted them. Protection had become hunger. Warmth had become tribute. Men who had laughed at seamwork now lay dying because someone had learned to profit from their ignorance. Morwenna turned to the veteran soldiers. "Bring every old cloak you can still move." They obeyed without looking at Roric first. That mattered. Old mantles slid across the snow, dragged by wounded men, guards, seam women, even commanders who had finally learned humility under frost. Morwenna knelt and spread them in a half-circle facing Elska. Elska's frost-white eyes narrowed. Patchwork will not stop a root. No, Morwenna said, "but memory will refuse a thief." She held out her bleeding hand toward Roric. "Your mantle." The courtyard went still. Roric understood before the others. His mantle carried the first final thread, the stitch that had held warmth around his wounded wolf for 16 winters. It was the oldest living anchor in the army. To use it, Morwenna would have to open his body memory before everyone. His weakness, his wound, his almost death. Roric unfastened the mantle and placed it in her hands. No hesitation. No pride. The commanders saw the frost mark beneath his collar, then still faint around his throat. They saw their Alpha King's wolf shadow flicker behind him, damaged but standing. Elska's smile widened. There he is, the broken wolf in the crown. Roric looked at his army. Yes. One word. The courtyard froze in a different way. Yes, he repeated louder. My wolf was cut before I wore the crown. Morwenna Vale's work kept me alive before I knew whose hands had done it. Any man who calls that weakness can take off his cloak and walk the ravine bare. No one moved. Morwenna's chest tightened once. Then she bent over his mantle. She laid it across the old cloak's first thread, touching every scarred lining. Red-silver light ran from one cloak to the next, slow and stubborn, forming not a command web but a circle of remembered bodies. Audrin's rib, Harl Ven's hands, Roric's wounded wolf. 100 survival oaths began speaking at once, low and rough beneath the storm. Elska raised both arms. The stolen cloaks around her lunged. Roric stepped forward. Morwenna snapped. Now he shifted, not fully into wolf, not enough to lose speech, but enough that his shadow rose behind him, vast and pale, the wounded royal beast baring its teeth before the entire army. Frost still clung to its chest. The old wound glowed white. Yet the wolf did not hide. It lowered its head to Morwenna's circle. The old cloaks answered. Red-silver threads shot upward from the snow and caught the stolen mantles before they reached her. Elska screamed as body memory tore against command root. Cloaks fought themselves in the air, half starving for stolen power, half remembering the men they had left behind. Morwenna drove her needle through Roric's first thread and into the circle of old cloaks. The pain hit him. He dropped to one knee but did not pull away. Names, Morwenna said through clenched teeth. Not ranks, names. Roric understood. He began to call them. Audrin Ma. The old cloak at Audrin's feet flared. Harl Ven. Another answered. Bessa Thornhand. Call Wren. Jorik Hale. Nen Wolf. Arvansor. Soldiers took up the roll. Seam women joined. Men who had never heard their names spoken by a king shouted them into the storm. Each name pulled a thread from Elska's stolen mass and sent it snapping back toward its rightful body. Elska staggered. No, she hissed. They belong to the army. Morwenna looked up, blood running down her wrist. They belong to themselves. The stolen cloaks began tearing away from Elska, one by one. Then the war standard split. A frost-white root lashed from its torn center, not toward the army this time, but toward Morwenna's heart. Roric lunged. Too late. The root wrapped around Morwenna's chest and pulled her against the banner pole. Elska, half stripped of stolen cloaks, smiled through blood and snow. Then let the seamstress be the final knot. All 10,000 war cloaks opened their inner seams at once and waited for Morwenna's blood. The war cloaks waited for Morwenna's blood. 10,000 inner seams opened across the frozen yard, red-silver lines exposed like veins beneath black wool. The frost-white root from the torn war standard held Morwenna against the banner pole tight across her chest, pulling harder each time she breathed. Her needle slipped in her bloody fingers. Snow gathered in her hair. Around her, men stared in horror as the cloaks that had once protected them asked for the woman who had made them remember how to live. Elska Dorne laughed through broken breath. There she whispered. The old craft shows its truth. One woman's hands, one woman's blood, one woman's life to hold an army together. How noble, how useful. Roric moved toward the banner, wolf shadow blazing behind him. Morwenna saw the killing look in his eyes. No. He stopped, every muscle locked. "The root is tied through the cloaks," she said, fighting for breath. "Tear it by force and you tear their body memory with it. Then tell me what to cut." "Nothing." Elska's smile sharpened. "Listen to her, my king. Seamstresses always know how to endure." Morwenna lifted her head. The pain in her chest became very clear. So did the insult beneath it. Endure. That was what they had called women's labor when they wanted it silent. Endure the long nights. Endure the bloodied fingers. Endure the jokes, the pity, the empty chair. No husband had filled the cradle she had never carried. The battle's men survived because her thread had known their wounds by heart. No more. Morwenna wrapped the silver thread around her bleeding hand and pulled it once. Not against the root, against the cloaks. Every open seam trembled. "Fenhall soldiers," she called, her voice rough but carrying. "Put your hands on your own cloaks." No one moved at first. Then Captain Odren pressed his palm to the red-silver lining at his chest. Others followed. Slowly. Then all at once. Frozen men, freed men, wounded men, proud men who had laughed in the hall and now looked ashamed beneath the snow. Their hands found seams, collars, hems, old repairs, hidden stitches. Each touched the place where Morwenna's craft had remembered them more faithfully than their commanders had. Elska snarled, "Do not obey her." Roric turned toward the army. "You heard the Oathmaker." The word struck the yard harder than any command. Oathmaker. Not spinster, not servant, not useful. Morwenna's throat tightened, but she did not let it break her voice. "Your cloaks are not mine to die for," she said. "They are yours to answer. Speak your names. Speak what your body survived. Speak what you choose to carry home." Odren went first. "Odren Mar," he said. "Arrow under the left rib. White ravine. I choose to return with breath, blood, and wolf unbroken." His cloak flared red. The root around Morwenna loosened a thread's width. Another soldier shouted Hull then. "Frostbitten hands. Eastern siege. I choose to return with both hands." A seam blazed. Then another. Bessa Thornhand. Broken shoulder. North ridge. Col Ren. Lung fever. Black winter. Joric hail. Brother buried at White Ravine. I carry his name home. The yard filled with names. Not ranks. Names. Each one pulled a piece of body memory away from the war standard and back into the body that owned it. The cloaks stopped waiting for Morwenna's blood. They began listening to the men inside them. Elska screamed and clawed at the master knot in her chest. They are soldiers. They belong to command. Morwenna looked at her through the storm. They belong to their own breath. Roric stepped to Morwenna's side and placed one hand on his old mantle. The pale wolf shadow behind him lowered its wounded head. "Roric Fenhall," he said, voice carrying over every wall. "Wolf cut before the crown. White ravine. I choose to return without hiding the wound another woman kept alive." The army went silent for one breath. Then his mantle blazed. The first final thread, the oldest living anchor in Fenhall, burned red gold through the snow. It struck the frost-white root at Morwenna's chest and did not cut it. It unstitched it. Lope by lope, lee by lee, command by command. Morwenna dropped from the banner pole. Roric caught her before she hit the ground. This time she let him, only for a moment. Then she pushed herself upright. Elska staggered backward as the stolen cloaks tore from her body. One flew to Odren, one to Hull, one to a boy-faced soldier with terror still wet on his cheeks. Each mantle returned to its living wearer, softer now, steaming with renewed oath. The master knot in Elska's chest blackened. "No," she gasped. "I held the root." Morwenna picked up her needle from the snow. "You held severed ends." The war standard cracked down the center. Its black wolf cloth split, and from inside the torn banner fell hundreds of cut threads, old brittles stolen from seam baskets, burial cloaks, widows' repairs, and forgotten hands. They lay in the snow like a graveyard of labor. The seam women began to kneel. Not to Roric, to the threads. Roric faced the war council, his wolf shadow still visible, wounded and unashamed. "By my crown and my blood, Morwenna Vale is restored before Fenhall as war oath maker. No cloak marches without her witness. No seam woman's labor is nameless again." No final thread is cut by council coin or pride. Elska laughed weakly. A king's gratitude. How touching. No, Morwenna said. She walked to Elska every step slow. This is not gratitude. This is record. She touched the needle to the blackened master knot. The stolen command seams turned inward. Elska's white war gown stiffened around her. Not enough to kill, enough to hold. The false seams she had sold, hidden and weaponized, wrapped her in her own obedience until she could not lift her hands. Morwenna leaned close. You wanted an army to wear you, she said. Now wear what you made. Elska fell to her knees in the snow, bound by dead command. Dawn broke over the cloak hall. Not warm, not gentle, but clear. The soldiers stood one by one, cloaks moving with them again, not as chains, not as masters, but as remembered protection. Men touched old patches and hidden seams with reverence. Seam women gathered the stolen threads from the snow, naming each hand they recognized. Roric came to Morwenna with his crown in one hand and his mantle over the other. He did not kneel. He did something harder for a king. He waited. What do you ask of me? He said. Morwenna looked at him at the army at the hall where laughter had become silence. Never call women's labor small again, she said. His face tightened with the weight of it. Never. And when you speak of victories, she added, name the hands that brought men home. Roric bowed his head. Before the whole army, he took her scarred hand and pressed it not to his mouth, but to the first final thread inside his mantle. Oathmaker, he said. The cloak warmed beneath her fingers. Morwenna looked past him to the soldiers waiting in the snow, every cloak alive again by consent, memory, and named labor. For the first time in Fenhall's history, the army marched only after the seamstress gave leave.